I am the director of the KJCC at NYU. Along with Associate Director Laura Torregano, it is our pleasure to host this evening's presentation of Marianne Newman's translation of Joan Fuster's aphorisms. Joining us are Maria Jose Galvez, General Director of Books and Promotion of Reading from the Ministry of Culture and Sport in Spain, and Veronica Cantó, President of the Valencian Academy of Language. Carmen Uribe, faculty member in the Creative Writing in Spanish program here at NYU and a very dear colleague. And of course, Marianne Newman, translator of the book, and Adam Gopnik, staff writer for The New Yorker and prologist for the English translation of Final Judgements. Before we begin, a note about today's programs. This event is live streamed, so I welcome everyone watching from elsewhere. I want to express my gratitude to KJCC Associate Director Laura Torregano, our center staff, as well as Mark Tio and Angeles Gregory Parra, who have worked with us for months to ensure that every detail has been taken care of. Following some official remarks, the program will move to presentations by our panelists, a brief Q&A, and then a trilingual reading of Fuster's aphorisms, followed by a reception in the atrium. I would now like to introduce the president of the Academia Valenciana de la Lengua, Veronica Cantó, who is actually unable to be here in person to accompany us, but has sent us a video to welcome those in attendance and celebrate the great Valencian writer, Joan Fuster, which the Academy is rendering homage to this year.
Good evening from Valencia. First of all, from the Academia Valenciana de la Lengua, we want to thank the King Juan Carlos I of Spain Center and his director, Jordana Mendelsohn, for hosting this event dedicated to Joan Fuster, one of the great European intellectuals of the 20th century, and of whom we are very proud that he was a Valencian. We also appreciate the participation in this event of Maria Jose Galvez, head of the Directorate General of Books and Promotion of Reading of Spanish Ministry of Culture and Sport, of Marianne Newman, who translated Joan Fuster's book Final Judgements into English, which we are presenting today. We are also pleased to greet Adam Gopnik, writer, essayist, and staff writer for The New Yorker, and Carmen Uribe, writer and professor at New York University. Also, thank you, Ms. Mendelsohn, for agreeing to act as moderator for this event. I regret that my obligations as president of the Academia Valenciana de la Lengua have prevented me from being in New York in person, but I am well represented by the two academics who are with you, Vicenta Tasa and Angels Gregori. Allow me to explain in just a few brushstrokes who Joan Fuster was and why we think it is absolutely necessary that his work be known beyond the country in which he forged his career as an essayist, poet, and translator. Fuster, a universal thinker, committed to the society he lived in, and also unequivocally committed to a lucid intellectual and civic attitude, equating him with the finest 20th century European thinkers. His critical and vital spirit was founded on the unalienable principle of intellectual freedom, just as Noam Chomsky is known throughout the world both for his contribution to linguistics and his involvement as a philosopher and political scientist, in short, as a thinker of the contemporary world. We aspire that Joan Fuster thinking should transcend all borders and be recognized as a profitable contribution to an ongoing reflection on topics and current events of our day. Fuster had a clear vocation for thinking, and thinking in a European manner, using doubt and skepticism as a method, and irony as his form of expression. He identified with the style of the French thinker Michel de Montaigne when he said, "I am myself the matter of my book, the measure of all things." As some Fuster scholars point out, he sits firmly at the center of the ethical and aesthetic movements of the 20th century Europe. His aphorisms are key for communicating, reasoning, or inciting debate. In his Consells Proverbis Insolències, translated into English under the title Final Judgements, you can see this. And you can also see that limits and borders are non-existent when it comes to thought, intellectual freedom as we call it. And when it comes to breaking conventions and becoming an hygienic, disinfectant tonic, as Fuster said when referring to his greatly admired Bertrand Russell. L'Acadèmia Valenciana de la Llengua ha homenatjat enguany Joan Fuster com a escriptor de l'any en el centenari del seu naixement i hem posat l'accent en totes les activitats que hem celebrat en l'obra d'este escriptor polièdric i d'activitats els assegure que n'han hagut moltíssimes. Com deia, hem posat l'accent en la poesia que hi va escriure, gens menyspreable, en la seva faceta de traductor, principalment d'autors francesos com Camus, en la gran quantitat de treballs crítics literaris, en els assajos sobre art, ètica o progrés, entre altres temes, en el Fuster articulista d'idees en premsa i un llarg etcètera. Així mateix, pensem que amb la traducció de la seva obra no sols contribuïm a internacionalitzar la figura del nostre intel·lectual, sinó que també contribuïm a conservar i amplificar el seu pensament. I no solament per a aquells que s'acosten a l'estudi de la nostra llengua i cultura, sinó també per als que vulguin gaudir de la vasta erudició i perspicàcia d'un personatge, d'un intel·lectual com Joan Fuster. Our Valencian intellectual was particularly interested in short essays, works of concise thought, and well-formed, sharp, and suggestive sentences. And it is precisely through his aphorisms where forceful phrases sum up his thoughts in a synthetic and provocative way, something in which he was a master. Fuster's aphorisms are irresistible, as Adam Gopnik tells us in the prologue to Final Judgements. You can read this yourself, and I encourage you to do so. So I cannot finish without highlighting a few aphorisms from this work. An honest intellectual begins with writing a sentence. The rest of his obra will be nothing more than a series of rectification of what he wrote the first day. And there is only one serious way to read, and it is to reread. Thank you very much for your attention, and may you enjoy a profitable reading of Joan Fuster. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. I'm sure that Victoria would love to be here with us in person. It's warming to think of her in Valencia, a little bit past midnight, so we can think about Veronica, that we can think about that. So I'm sure as she's watching, she'll be enjoying to hear the commentary. Now it is my honor to introduce Maria Jose Galvez, General Director for Books and Reading Promotion in the Spanish government, in charge of promoting literary creation and translation in Spain's official languages, supporting the publishing sector, and fostering the increase in reading, especially through public libraries. We had a really animated conversation this afternoon, and we're really looking forward to collaborating with Maria Jose in the future. She was previously chief editor for Tirán La Blanc Publishers, worked in the Spanish Parliament and government, She's also an associate professor, so we always love to have professors in the house at the Carlos III Universidad de Madrid, and holds a PhD in constitutional law. So Maria Jose, thank you so much for joining us.
Bona vesprada. Buenas tardes. Good evening. Thank you very much for being here, sharing your time, and thank you to those that are listening also to us. I think Fuster would have liked very much this academic talking, having this critical thinking at the very heart of this project, and the humor too. Thanks to Professor Jordana Mendelsohn and Laura Turegano for hosting this book presentation, this book translation this evening. Thank you very much for your warm welcoming here. And of course, thank you to the Academia Valenciana de la Llengua, to the President, Verónica Cantó, and to Vicenta Tassa and Àngels Gregori. They both are academics and they both are here, and friends, and thank you very much for being here. You are the center of this book and this project. Thank you very much. And of course, thank you, Marianne Newman. You are the creator of this translation, this needed translation, in order to do universal or more universal the figure of our intellectual of Joan Fuster with these aphorisms, because Joan Fuster is very well known about the political writings and Nosaltres es Valencians that we all read when we were youth, at least myself. But he was also a great poet, he was a great philosopher, historian, and he had a very huge and sharp sense of humor. And here I think the clever he was, and the use of the words so synthetic and condensed and exact they are in this word. So I think it's not so easy to translate Joan Fuster, and thank you very much for having this. It's the only way that people that don't speak Catalan could read this amazing job of Joan Fuster. So thank you very much. I'm so honored to be here on behalf of the Spanish Ministry of Culture, because this is our and my job now to support our literatures and in his linguistic diversity too, and we are here for that this evening. As in the epilogue of this book is said, Joan Fuster was a unicorn, and I hope that everybody that is here this evening and everybody that is listening, if they don't know, they still don't know that Joan Fuster was a unicorn, they find it tonight through this book and through hearing you talking about Fuster and his literary books too. So I wish you all enjoy very much hearing today talking about Joan Fuster and his aphorism. Fuster said that dir bon dia és ja una forma de fer literatura, more or less he said that. So I hope you all are doing great literature, because we are saying not bon dia but good evening, so it's more or less the same sense that Fuster wanted. Thank you very much, and please join us to the table, Marianne and Kirmen. Carmen Uribe is a Basque language writer whose first novel, Bilbao, New York, Bilbao, won the National Prize for Literature in Spain in 2009. His works has been published in the New Yorker or the Paris Review. He's on the faculty of the creative writing in the Spanish program at the NYU, and tonight he joins us to discuss the place of Fuster in the context of the Iberian literature or the Peninsulan literature or whatever you want to share with us tonight. You have the floor, Carmen.
Thank you, Gabon. Good night. Bona nit. Yes, I'm really happy to be here. I'm really glad and honored to be here in the presentation of a book that was written in Valencia, in Catalan, and is translated by a good friend of mine. So. Really happy to be here with Maria Jose Galvez, Jordana Meldason, and all of you. So, yeah, yesterday I was at Washington D.C. presenting my book there, okay, in a gathering with readers and writers, and then when I was coming here, I was thinking on how difficult was the time of Joan Fuster. It is maybe the most difficult time for writers in Spain that time. So you have to imagine, or you have to see that, of course, it was a big renaissance, a big... What? like a big reborn of culture and literatures in Spain, in Spanish, Catalan, Galician, and Basque before the Spanish Civil War. Then, with the Civil War, a lot of writers went to exile. As you know. Some writers were shot, as Lorca or Basque writers like La Wacheta, they were shot. And then the 40s and 50s were like years of nothing. Completely silence in the Spanish culture, in all Spanish cultures. So then, in the last 50s, beginning of the 60s, there are some intellectuals that begin to write in Catalan, in Galician, in Basque, but they are like islands in such a devastating atmosphere. So, think on a figure of Joan Fuster. His parents were Francoist. His father was Francoist. He himself was Francoist in his youth. But then, in the 50s and overall in the 60s, he finds his identity again. One identity that was completely forbidden, forgotten, left aside. So it's in the United States. I think it will be really easy to understand figures as Joan Fuster, because his life. It's like finding himself, no? It's like finding his identity again, his lost identity. So we speak a lot about identity in the States now. No, it's everybody is like fighting and wants to speak and wants to write in the lost, once lost or forbidden, forgotten identities. So now there is a big revolution on that. There are new voices, different voices, writing in a different way in the United States. And a lot of writers come from little, smaller identities or forgotten or silenced identities. So Joan Fuster, Álvaro Cunqueiro, and in the Basque Country, Gabriel Arestis, a little bit younger, but could be called Michelena. They were intellectuals that they are like the el eslabón perdido, like
the lost link.
Lost link of the cultures between the intellectuals of that were writing before the Civil War, all this big reborn of cultures, literatures, art. It was like a big explosion. And then Joan Fuster and his generation will be like the bridge that will help the generation of writers continue to write in languages as non-hegemonic languages as Basque, Catalan, and Galician. Also in Spanish, that time is really important because there are, I think, overall poets like Ángel González or Jaime Gil de Viedma, and that generation is of the same generation of Joan Fuster. So they write in those really difficult years. Then, everybody knows, then democracy came, and then a lot of, there was a new reborn of culture. But I think Joan Fuster and his generation is important for that, because they kept the light for the next generation first, and then it's like suddenly they see that there is a culture that was silenced, that was forbidden, that was forgotten, that was left aside, and they built a new identity through the culture, reading books from his own tradition. But if you read the book, it's amazing, because he speaks about Catalan writers, and then he speaks about international writers, musicians, artists. It's amazing. It's amazing. So culture was the way. So being a cultured person was the way to recover this lost identity. I have to say to finish that two things. One thing, as a Basque, always the Basque culture have seen. So the Basques always were like looking to Barcelona, looking to Valencia to inspire themselves, to inspire their literature and to inspire their movement also, their cultural movement. So Joan Fuster was really important on that because he was a big intellectual, but at the same time he was really committed with his culture. A good intellectual who is committed with his culture. So Vasquez saw this example, and they followed the same path as Joan Fuster and his generation in País Valencià. So I see a lot of. I see that we can speak a lot about his work and his achievements, but I want to conclude telling that I love his aphorisms, but there is a couple. One is irony needs complicity. Can be? It's complicity?
Yes.
It's complicity. And small cultures, they need complicity too. And another thing is that he was really a skeptic, no? In a way. Because he was committed, and he was really. And in another aphorism, he says, I am an optimistic. I close my eyes. But maybe he was closing his eyes because he was dreaming, or because he needed to dream. So while I was reading the book, I was thinking, wow, it seems a sad book a lot of times. It could be like a negative book, no? A lot of times, like not so optimistic, like pessimistic. But now the society of Valencia, it's really different from the society he was living. So he wasn't optimistic. he was really, I don't know. But then he achieved it. No? Because now Valencia is a really diverse place where the language is really strong, and the language is related to some values, progressive values. So now, in Spain, progressiveness is linked to diversity, and diversity also when we are speaking about cultures and about small languages. So he did it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirmen. I think I know we are some Valencians here tonight. It's my opinion. He gave us the dignity, maybe, and to believe in ourselves,
Yes.
and to question about who we are and who we were. And I think we have achieved more dignity, and this is thanks to the bravery of and
Yes.
also of Joan Fuster. This week before introducing Marianne Newman, and I know she doesn't need any presentation, but I will do it anyway. This last week we were in this Fuster, Ein Fuster in Madrid, paying tribute to Fuster through another very well-known author. He's Valencian. He writes mostly, I think, almost everything in Spanish. He's Manuel Vicente.
Sí.
And he knew Fuster, and he told us about the intimate Fuster. And he was, I don't know the word in English, provocador, defiant?
Provocative.
Provocative. He told us that he had this very sharp sense of humor. He was not dogmatic at all. Mm-hmm. He had the doubt in everything that he wrote, and that he all the time was drinking whiskey while he was eating paella, and he smoked all the time, and he was so skinny. And in the end, he was not a very era incómodo, una figura incómoda.
Yeah, he was an uncomfortable figure.
Uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I didn't think uncomfortable. It could be referred to a person. It was an uncomfortable person, almost for everybody. So he became silent at the very end, and just because of an anniversary of the death of Josep Pla, he returned to speak and to talk and to a round table in order to talk. And I really appreciate that Manuel Vicente also explained us the very intimate part of being of Joan Fuster. Mm. So I'm going to introduce you.
Sure.
Yeah. Marianne Newman is the director of the Farragut Fund for Catalan Culture in the US. She's a translator, editor, and occasional writer on Catalan culture. She has translated a novel and a short story collection by Quim Monzó, essays by Xavier Robert de Ventós, and a collection of poems by Josep Carner. Newman was awarded the Creu Sant Jordi in 1998, the J.V. Cendrós International Award for Òmnium Cultural, and the North American Catalan Society for Scholarship in 2006, and the Ramon Llull International Award in 2022. She is the translator of Joan Fuster, Consells, Proverbis y Insolències, Final Judgment. That is the book that we are presenting also tonight.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure finally to meet you. And I think one of the things that I'd like to comment about is what a voracious reader. I mean, in the Fuster was living through the darkest times of Francoism, but I think it was reading that kept him alive and that kept him in contact with the world. And the incredible thing is that he rarely left his little town of Sueca. But first of all of the intelligentsia of Spain beat a path to his door. Everybody went to see him. The mountain went to Mohammed in this case. And I think the importance of reading, even under censorship, and even in a period of such tremendous. This book is written in the 60s. And as I'm going to quote a couple of aphorisms in my remarks that are relevant today and to the American political situation, for example. Not only political, it's he does everything from philosophy to humor. I mean, I find the book really, when I was translating it, even sometimes it would make me laugh out loud.
Yeah, of course.
So it was a great pleasure. It was not easy, but it was a great pleasure to translate because he's just so sly. He's so clever, and yeah. But anyway, so but this part of the question, that as a translator that and there are a number of translators in the house, which I'm very grateful for. But part of our challenge is how does this kind of book get to be published? So, right? So I'd like to start by acknowledging and expressing my gratitude to everyone who has made this evening possible. Sometimes the acknowledgements are a little bit pro forma, but I would like to linger a bit on them because it truly took several villages to bring us together. Some in Valencia, some in New York, you know, and a number in between, and some in the New York Basque connection. So I'm often a little bit skeptical about centenaries because they also seem a little pro forma. But this one has been really exceptional. I feel as though the figure of Joan Fuster, everybody knew, oh yes, Joan Fuster. But if I tried buying books in Barcelona when I was translating, and there really weren't any. I mean, he had sort of fallen out of edition. And so the fact that the Academia Valenciana de la Lengua, it put the priority on publishing in Catalan. In Spanish, there's a new translation of Consells Proverbis y Insolencias. No, for me it's Final Judgments.
Y Sagitario también, ¿no?
Yeah, there's a new publication in Spanish as well, and when we do our trilingual reading, the Spanish translations come from that book. But you know, I think the fact that there was this effort to say, okay, Fuster belongs in the world, and we're going to translate him into English. That was an incredible decision, I think. So, Joan Fuster is a great writer, but he was a great underread writer. And I would like to explain also why it's called Final Judgments, because, in fact, Consells Proverbis y Insolencias is almost untranslatable, and it wasn't really worth making that effort because it, you know, counsels or advice, proverbs, and insolence isn't a good title in English. And the book is actually a compilation of two books called Final Judgments and Dishonest Propositions. So I thought that was a title that just would grab you, you know, because Final Judgment, there's even a joke in the title. Final judgment is always singular. There's only one final judgment, el judici final, no? But Final Judgments is playing with the whole question of judgment,
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's his joke, but I thought it was worth pointing to. So anyway, I went to the Ateneo Barcelonès, which is a great centenary institution as well, with a fabulous library. And I found Consells Proverbis y Insolencias and a few other books. And before I came back to New York, I went to a few bookstores and I tried to find Consells, and it wasn't available anywhere. So I checked the book out of the library at the Ateneo and I brought it back to New York. I absconded with the Ateneo's copy. And each time I returned to Barcelona this year, I apologized for keeping the book beyond its due date. But finally, I confessed to the librarian that I was logging miles on the book between Barcelona and New York, and the librarian took pity on me and allowed me to keep it until I finished the translation. I also had a PDF, but I like leafing through the book.
Yeah.
So I would like to acknowledge the Academia Valenciana de la Lengua, which decided that the best way to celebrate a great local author is to guarantee his presence in bookstores through new editions of his work and to share him far and wide through translation. And I believe there are biographies in the works for which I will be very grateful, because it was no mean task to put together a coherent vision of Fuster as I translated. Of course, Fuster would scoff at the notion of coherence, defender that he was of contingency. But in any case, I'm looking forward to the biographies. Because you really do have to piece him together from his own writings, from writings of other people. I would like to make a general comment about biography in the peninsula. It doesn't really exist. And many of the works about authors are actually about their work and not about their lives, right? So it's really wonderful that there will be work about his life, because his life was also exemplary in many ways. And strange, as you were saying, he was a Carlist. He said that his father was a working class Carlist, and that was
Yes.
why he was different from the more conservative ones. That was why he allowed him to grow intellectually and read anything he wanted, right? So it wasn't a repressive household.
He was born in a fire.
He was?
Burned.
Yes.
Burned in
Oh,
a fire.
burned, yes,
Sorry.
yes, sorry.
He was burned in a fire, and later on, Vicent Andrés Estellés dedicated him a poetry about that thing that happened, because that told us Manuel Vicent, that he told that we in Valencia we eat rats. So people in Valencia were so angry about that. We don't eat rats, but at the time was a typical plate that could have some albufera. This is a lake that we have in
Yes.
Valencia. It's a nonsense, but he was burned in a fire. He was not an uncomfortable intellectual or person. So I think I agree with you. We need this biography about Joan Fuster. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I think it's much better if it's a conversation. I much prefer that we be talking with one another, yeah. So, anyway, the book would not exist without the enthusiastic support of Dr. Ramón Ferrer Navarro, the former president of the Academia, and Doctora Verónica Cantó, who addressed her remarks to us earlier, the current president, and the newly minted member of the Academy, Angelos Gregori, who put us in touch. It might exist in someone else's translation, but I am thankful for those 2 degrees of separation that put Angelos, and Angelos put me in touch with the Academia. And also grateful to the publisher, Douglas Suttle, the publisher of Funda Stampa Press, which is an unusual organization as well, because it's a UK publisher, but located in Villafranca del Penedès. But without Douglas's pushing to get the book out this year, I mean, we really started the translation in February. The book wouldn't be here either. So anyway, this beautiful little book came out in September thanks to Douglas. Look at this gorgeous end page.
Yeah.
It's a very, very nice little object. Anyway, on completing my first draft of the book, it dawned on me what an absolute jewel it was. And in 2019, a brilliant piece on aphorism as a literary form had been published by Adam Gopnik in The New Yorker. 2 degrees also separated me from him, and I prevailed upon a colleague at The New Yorker to be an intermediary for Fuster. I told them that Fuster was an ironist with a Mediterranean sense of humor, a Marxist along the lines of both Karl and Groucho, a skeptic with a sensual streak. Gopnik agreed to read the book, and to my great delight was so engaged that he agreed to do the prologue. Similarly, Paul Holdengraber, one of the great interviewers and readers, he used to be the director of public programming at the New York Public Library, and everything he touched was golden. He has done the blurb on the back, which is really brilliant, as everything he does, as is everything he does. And of course, I'm really grateful to Kierman for giving us the view from the Basque Country of Fuster, because I was very curious, in fact, as exactly how much he was read. I don't know if you want to expand on that. I mean, because I started reading Fuster in the 70s in Barcelona, through Hermano Lobo, through the humor magazines, Por Favor, and also Telexpress, the Barcelona Vespertino, the afternoon paper. And he was writing everywhere because that was how he made his living. He has one fabulous phrase. He says, writing is, you put a sheet of paper in the typewriter. If you're still writing an hour and a half later, you're losing money. So anyway, but he was writing everywhere. you know. Anyway, so these things, these shows of support on the basis of literary quality are not inconsequential. One of the challenges of trying to bring so-called lesser-known languages, not only Catalan or Valencian, but also Czech or Kenyan or Hindi, is their lack of context. When I translated Kim Munzo's book of short stories in 1986, the book was assigned to a reviewer. He got a boxed note in the New York Times, but the book was assigned to a reviewer who compared him to Garcia Lorca, an author with whom he shared nothing as author, beyond when a more logical comparison would have been to John Updike or Raymond Carver. So for this is one of the problems for foreign literatures in the American context. If you don't get the right person to comment, it's almost, it doesn't help. So for an expert in aphoristic literature, an erudite in aphoristic literature, to situate a heretofore unknown author in English among his universal peers is a very rare gift, and that's what Gopnik does in the prologue. It's really splendid. Thankfully, everyone who reads the book, even just a couple of pages, agrees. Fuster's wit is universal, and you don't have to be an expert in aphorisms to enjoy it. The two books collected here, Final Judgements and Dishonest Propositions, have a perennial appeal. Written and published largely in the 1960s, with some entries dated in the 50s, they are painfully relevant. For example, Americans of 2020, it's impossible to talk about the book without quoting from it, so can certainly identify with the following. Who can say why? But the poor tend to vote for right-wing candidates. The rich, too, of course. Mind you, this is written in the 60s, with Spain still in the thick of Francoism. Fuster was born, lived, breathed, wrote, and died in Sueca, Valencia. He was a voracious reader with no books from childhood on, no books in his childhood, no books in the house. I highly recommend his charming prologue, in which he attributes his taste for aphorisms to the Jesuit daily calendar that graced his walls as a child. You remember the ones that you would rip off every day? And they had a saying, and they would tell you the phases of the moon and all of that. Well, that was his reading material as a child. And once he abandoned his law career, he wrote copiously in Spanish for the Valencian and Barcelona dailies, and in Catalan for reviews published in exile or under the umbrella of the church, like Serrador. He was a skeptical Marxist, and two of my favorite aphorisms are, "It is logical that all Marxists be more Marxist than Marx." And another one is, Lenin or Marx, or both of them, said that until now all revolutions have ended up reinforcing the machinery of the state. Reactions to revolutions, too. The machinery of the state is always reinforced with any excuse. I think I'm almost done. To be honest, he was skeptical about everything, starting with himself. One of Fuster's claims to fame. Do you want to comment? Do you have any? I don't want to.
No, don't worry.
Okay. One of Fuster's claims to, just interrupt me. Claims to fame, and perhaps his biggest albatross, was his book, Nosaltres els Valencians. Its view of Valencian culture as part of a continuum with Catalan and Balearic culture earned him the opprobrium of right and left, and a couple of bombs at his home. Fuster said of himself that he was impassioned almost to the point of obsession by the life and destiny of my people. But he ended his life disappointed that neither Valencia nor Barcelona, that moment when he was retired, neither Barcelona nor Valencia had found a way to act as the capital for this greater political continuity that he envisioned. But his patently political works are not the cornerstone of his legacy, or not the only one. They are his claim to fame, to a certain extent. They're the thing that put him on the map for a lot of people. But It is his beautiful and rare mixture of skepticism, sensuality, and humor. Here is a sample. 5 bodily senses. We demand more. Or his keen sensitivity to language. In essence, euphemisms are already lies that make him the great writer he is. It has been a rare pleasure to translate him, because translator is one of the best ways to get inside the head of an author. To translate is to smuggle a work across the border in your head. It is to free it from the vicissitudes of its local situation and recontextualize it in the context of world literature. Fuster belongs on the world stage, and it is a privilege to have smuggled him into New York today. My last acknowledgement is rooted in friendship. Thank you, Dr. Jordana Mendelsohn, for inviting us into this house, teeming with so many extraordinary activities under your leadership, for the debut of Final Judgements in English. Not coming? Not here yet. Well, do you want to read some aphorisms, or would you like to? Shall we comment? Shall we talk about Fuster?
Yeah.
As you want, as you both said, some aphorisms you like very much about Fuster. I like very much that one. I don't remember exactly. That is morir deu ser algo així com deixar d'escriure. To die must be something like not writing.
Not writing
anymore.
anymore.
Yes, this is beautiful.
I like this.
Yes, another one that's my posterity will be on paper. Yeah.
Yes, he liked very much when everything was getting so. He was an erudite.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But as I said before, he was not a dogmatic.
Mm-hmm.
And he liked very much not to take himself so much seriously, because when you were giving him the reason in something, he said a boutade, and he wanted you to think, and this is what I appreciate most about Fuster. They made us think. You can agree or not with everything that he said or wrote, but of course you agree in this critical thinking and put you a question, and you have to think, to really think, and I believe this is what Fuster left us. And then in my vision, we have that poems, or those poems of Fuster, so beautiful, and we have Lluís Llach, Raimon,
Yes.
Maria del Mar Bonet, a lot of singers that perform their poetry, and this is the only way, at least myself, that I could achieve the poetry of Fuster until I grew up, because I didn't find some books about poetry of Fuster when I was a teenager.
Right. Well, that's another thing that has come out this
Yeah.
year, and it's
Yeah.
so important and so beautiful. Actually, at the end of we have a PowerPoint of the aphorisms. We don't need to see the PowerPoint, but there's a little gift at the end, which is a tiny, beautiful, beautiful poem that he wrote
Yeah.
as a very young man, and okay, and I couldn't resist translating it. So. Right, it's at the very end. I can read it in Catalan, and would you read it in English?
Jordana.
Or Jordana? Treva. Per què no, cor? Per què no? Would you read it in Catalan?
No, you read it.
Okay. Si l'amor és sempre igual, si les roses no s'acaben, per què no, amor? Per què no? And in English?
Well, you read it in English too.
Yeah.
You're right there.
Truce. Why not, my heart? Why not? If death is always there, yet roses are there too. Why not, my love? Why not?
So beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, and he was, I don't know, very young when he wrote that. But it's I don't know how you feel about the translation. You know, now this is really sort of like a striptease to have the English and the Spanish and the Catalan together. But you just said something that I wanted to comment on. Yes, it was hard to get to. It's hard to get to his books, but it's also he says that the best thing you can have is a contrarian,
Yes.
Yeah.
because
Yes.
he says basically, if I don't have one, I have to invent it, and he's constantly looking. Many of the aphorisms are actually him contradicting himself. You know, and it's just an intellectual habit. He is not. He never rests on one idea. One of the aphorisms I love is when he says, "We say idée fixe, but then it's not an idea."
That's the condensation of the thinking of Fuster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, one of the many.
One of the many. Yeah.
But it's so beautiful. I mean, that is also one of his other techniques to take a frase feta, a set phrase. How do you say frase feta? A stock phrase, and pick up the intention, the hidden intentionality that we have forgotten because we've listened to it so much. There's another one that I really it was a challenge to translate that, and we're not going to be reading it in the prepared aphorisms, but it's in Catalan, it's també ens cansem de desesperar, which is and in Catalan, of course, everybody who speaks Catalan or Spanish knows that aphorism is based on el que espera desespera. No? So també ens cansem de desesperar. And so I translated the second part as we also tire of despair. But in English, you have that whole question of to wait and to hope. And I went over, I was thinking a great deal about, well, should I say, he who hopes despairs, but we also tire of despair? And I put it out there on Twitter, and somebody wrote, and somebody wrote, and Antonio Martin Monterde answered, and he said, "No, Marianne, just leave it with we also tire of despair." So I did, and I think our special guest is here.
Yeah, I love one that says, and it's about his way of being, like.
I feel like Adam arrived
Hello.
on cue. Thank you. Just perfect. Marian and Kierman just finished.
Oh, fantastic.
I love this one that says, vinegar is still wine. This is great.
Brilliant.
No? Brilliant. He was a genius.
And another one that he said that the only way of reading is rereading.
Yes.
So
yeah,
maybe we can do that with Fuster.
Well, the thing is, once you start talking about it, it's
Yeah.
like in exchanging baseball cards. I have my favorite. Thank you, Adam, for coming. Would you like to introduce?
Okay, because I think this is my function.
Yes.
So Adam Gopnik has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1986. He received his Bachelor in Art History from McGill University before completing his graduate work at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. His publications include a collection of essays from Paris to the Moon, an adventure novel, The King in the Window, Through the Children's Gate, A Home in New York, The Table Comes First, family, friends, and the meaning of food, and 1,000 small sanities. And he joined us now as the prologuist to this new translation of Fuster's Final Judgment to discuss Fuster in the context of the universal of the world literature and the history of aphorism.
Only the universality of world
Only
literature
that.
and the history of aphorisms. Why don't we throw in the meaning of life as well to do it? Thank you all for patience. I apologize for being late getting here. I was giving a lecture at the 92nd Street Y on the history of American rhyme, and I raced down here.
Wow.
And racing down in December in New York, as you all know, means a slow crawl down any street you take. So my apologies for being late, but my thanks for inviting me here. And let me say, this is one of those things that happens rather rarely in a writer's life or a critic's life. Marianne sent me this, Fuster is correct?
Fuster.
Fuster's in manuscript, and I was completely ignorant of his work, but I have a lifelong attraction to, indeed addiction to, aphorisms and to aphoristic prose. I attempt to write it, more or less unsuccessfully, but I am always in love with it. And I had done a long piece about the aphorism for the New Yorker about a year ago, I guess. So
Right
I'm
before COVID, I think.
I'm of the age now, which is an aphorism of itself, when everything took place 5 years ago. It could have been 10 years ago, and it was 5 years ago. It could have been last year, and it feels like it was 5 years ago. We're at that moment where it's placed. And knowing nothing about him at all, I was simply entranced by the wit, the comedy, which I think we all evidenced as I came into the room, the way people laugh. And I was fascinated at his aphorisms, and I was fascinated by trying to crack the code as best I could, with Marianne's not merely her help, but her guidance, her Virgil to my aphoristic Dante, of the sensibility that had produced this extraordinary body of work, and as best I understand, and it's something that I think, at the risk of being unduly aphoristic, and one of the risks and joys of the aphorism is that it stands no in-between cases. We don't, when we go to the great French aphorists, we don't want them to say, it's difficult for us, for the most part, to take extraordinary pleasure in the misfortunes of the good fortune of most of our friends. Well, that's not how an aphorism works. An aphorism is an absolute statement, or it's nothing. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So is the road to heaven, actually, if you think about it. But that's what we want from an aphorism. And as a consequence, in lots of ways, the aphorism, it's always seemed to me, and I throw this out to the panel, is a conservative form in lots of ways, because its great gift is for compressing into the minimal grammatic and lexical space a common wisdom. You couldn't very well argue a revolutionary new idea about the world in aphorisms, it seems to me. You couldn't you couldn't write John Stuart Mill's On Liberty aphoristically, but you could certainly write, Carlyle could write the opposition to it aphoristically, because it condenses for us into the pithiest possible point something that we all know but has never been so sharply or neatly expressed. And so in that sense, one of the things that fascinates me about this book and the work, and what entranced me about it, was the sheer wit that filled every page. I opened it truly at random and find 3 jewels right away. And what's more, all skulls, like all sexes, are the same, more or less. If you really think about it, you will find that no one deserves your envy. And this one, which I think is a classic. It is good to believe we are loved by others, since it helps us love them back. Which, if you think about it, is worthy of Montaigne or La Rochefoucauld, exactly. It's good we choose to love others in order to receive. So it's not the Christian lesson that we ought to love others because they deserve it. It's a selfish impulse that's raised to a positive one. And I think that's a very common theme in his work, and indeed amongst all great aphorists. They press the hard truth of life upon us, but then they civilize it for us and tell us that there's nothing wrong with the hard truth of life. It can be as I say, can be civilizing. And in that sense, I think, and I throw out at the panel, that the aphorism is in its nature a conservative form in a positive sense. But what I gather from his history and from what I've learned of his biography, that though conservative and Catholic in many of his original impulses, the specific circumstances of Spanish and of Catalan life drove him in another and more liberal direction throughout his life. And so he fascinates me as one of those characters, as someone who's written a great deal about liberal sensibility and the liberal temperament, who embodies a liberal temperament in a conservative form. And if I had to say, what is the single thing that Fuster contributes to the European, Western aphorism, that would be the thing I would land on, that he has a liberal temperament in a conservative form. I wonder if that strikes you as a fair description.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think he actually became a pretty convinced leftist, but his skepticism was so radical that he was skeptical also about the possibilities of revolution or of change. And in that sense, absolutely, you're right, that it's a conservative worldview. Yeah, it doesn't really believe in change in a way, even though he contributes to it. Yeah, but Maria Jose made that point earlier.
Can I ask a question that comes out of the unplumbable depths of my ignorance? We think in English of the aphorism as being, though there are many outstanding English aphorists, it is primarily for us a French form. That's where it radiates from, and we turn to the French aphorists from Rochefoucauld to Joubert and beyond in the first place. Is there an indigenously Spanish or indeed Catalan tradition of the aphorism, or is it there too as well part of a tropism towards France?
Definitely there's a tropism toward France, which informed all of the kind of Mediterranean intellectuals, partially because they couldn't look to Spain, which was even more conservative. But I think there is a short form, there's a tendency toward short form in Catalonia, not necessarily aphorisms, but there was a writer before Fuster called Eugène Dors, who wrote daily newspaper articles, short, brief daily newspaper articles that he called, he would fix on an anecdote and extrapolate from it a lesson. And he's an amazing writer, but he ended up collaborating with Franco, and so he's sort of like a Celine. He's there's always an asterisk after his name, but he was a brilliant writer. And I think, but of course, Fuster goes and he compresses that even more. But he was a great reader of Eugène Dors and a terrible critic of him.
Of his politics.
He has an aphorism about Eugène Dors.
He has a number of them. Yeah, I can only find them on the computer.
Yeah.
But there was another, even in prose, there was I think the question of time has a lot to do with Catalan short form, because Pere Caldés was in exile in Mexico. He's a short story writer, a really wonderful one.
Right.
And he established, the Catalans were very important in establishing publishing. The exiled Catalans after the Civil War established great, important publishing enterprises in Latin America. And he said, well, I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I write a short story because that's all I have time for before I go into work. So, I mean, they're...
Well, can I throw another question out? I did 40 years ago. One of the themes of my still unfinished PhD dissertation was...
Oh, mine is unfinished.
Oh, is it really? I am year 39 ABD. I wrote it, but I never footnoted it and never submitted it.
Yep.
I am the only one, and I have 6 brothers and sisters, and believe it or not, I am the only one without a PhD, which is what we call a Jewish dropout, But it's one of its subjects. It was about the birth of Cubism and the caricature, and one of its subjects was Picasso and the caricature. And one of the fascinating things was that Picasso's kind of embryonic seedbed, if that's not an oxymoron, was drawing cartoons and caricatures in the very rich context of Barcelona culture of that time. And I wonder if there isn't, again, some kind of cultural affinity with the compressed, the epigrammatic, a liking for those particular forms, caricature, aphorism, short story.
I think there's another dissertation.
I won't finish. There's another dissertation to leave unfinished. I have to.
My unfinished dissertation is about Eugénie Dors.
Oh, really?
Listen.
Yes.
Something is about, sorry for interrupting.
Oh,
No,
no,
please.
no, it's a conversation.
It's about the Acte. Just a comment. There's a very famous, it's in Castilian though, but in the 17th century, Baltasar Gracián wrote the very famous, translated into English as The Oracle, a manual of the art of discretion. There are like 300 aphorisms, and it's a very famous book to take into account responding to your question. I just couldn't help it thinking, because I have it at home. I bought it here in New York in English.
It's a wonderful book. It's funny though, I've never seen Fuster comment on Gracián. And at least in the books I've read, he doesn't mention him, but absolutely.
I found the aphorism by Eugénie Dors.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read
Please.
I don't know.
it? Yes?
Yes, of course.
Eugénie Dors, are you kidding? That old French right-wing intellectual?
Yeah.
Old French right-wing
Old
intellectual.
French, yes.
Meaning aligned
Yes,
with Maurras
yes,
and that
yes.
sort of
Yeah.
Action
Yes.
Française
Yes,
school,
yes,
as opposed to being a Spanish Francoist.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, and he became a Spanish Francoist, but he
His
definitely
ideology,
started out
right.
as an Action Française.
It's a nice distinction that he's
Yeah.
being made there.
Uh-huh. Well, would you do make some comparisons in you contextualize Fuster in your prologue, and I wonder if you would like to talk about it or expand on it or tell us why you compared him to Chesterton, I think, which I thought was absolutely fabulous comparison.
Yeah, well, Chesterton is a great love of mine, G.K. Chesterton, who was not an aphorist in the same way, that is, someone who published books of aphorisms, but who wrote some of the most extraordinary aphoristic prose, and who was simultaneously a Catholic and a kind of anarchist. I mean, and in his interesting period in his pre-World War I mode, Chesterton was a Catholic already, but he was, as I say, he was more drawn to a kind of mystical anarchism rather than to authoritarianism, as later happened, as I think was a pattern throughout Europe, though that kind of sensibility became frightened and significantly more authoritarian as the century went on than it was at the beginning. But Chesterton's greatest aphorisms, I think, are ones that we all live with. One that's the most famous and somewhat dubious is that a man who does not believe in God will not believe in nothing, he will believe in anything, which is seen as prescient of the collapse of faith and the rise of fascism in plain English. The idea of, another one I've always loved is the idea of blasphemy depends on the idea of belief. Try to think a blasphemous thought about Thor, right? In other words, once a faith has vanished, it's impossible to have opposition to it or blasphemy towards it. And there again, I think that Chesterton struck me as a very similar figure, knowing nothing about, in the sense that it comes again out of a particular kind of, for lack of a better word, Catholic anarchist position. That is someone who is impressed by order and loves order, because aphorisms, after all, are our most beautiful microcosmic expression of literary order. They can't be done, they're witty, they can't be done in a witless or prolix or overly ornate way. But at the same time, they are they open the door to some larger sensibility. They're dangerous in a certain way. They're not in themselves. You can't imagine, in a certain sense, you can't imagine a fascist aphorist any more than, in a certain sense, you can imagine a fascist jazz musician, because they depend on a certain freedom of imagination and a skepticism of the mind.
Yes.
They're a humanist form in the deepest sense. And so Chesterton fascinates me always because he was all of those things, and in very much in the same way, and then took a terribly dark turn towards anti-Semitism and authoritarianism within the First World War and ever more painfully afterwards. And it interests me too that Fuster, as I understand, in a certain sense, took the opposite direction in his own political evolution.
Yeah.
And he did, definitely. But I wonder if that is because, I mean, he was living under Franco, so there was an example of what not to do.
Yes.
Yeah.
No. And I think that's a fascinating point and very relevant because in lots of ways, in unspeakably tragic ways, Francoism represented what Chesterton thought he wanted. That is a highly ordered, hierarchical, Catholic, medievalist, in some respects, country. And that's what it was. In other words, that was not what Chesterton imagined such a world would be. He saw it as being like some 19th century pre-Raphaelite dream of the Middle Ages. That's what he had in mind in the gray, oppressive, hierarchical and rigid and culturally impoverished society that dream would actually produce was not always his way. I wrote once in one of my own pet aphorisms of my own that kind of dandy intellectual can only dream of a closed society, but only exist in an open one. And I think that's true of both of these kinds of imaginations. They love the dream of order, stained glass, hierarchy, lost mystical wholeness of community. But it's only possible to dream of that kind of society credibly when you're actually living in an open society that sustains and nourishes cosmopolitan pluralism.
Right. Otherwise you get the Inquisition.
Yes, exactly. Exactly so. And so I think that's one of the things that makes one of the places that I was very set off. There's also a very obscure English contemporary, not contemporary, he's dead now, 20th century British aphorist, Geoffrey Madden, who almost no one knows about.
Would you tell us a little about him? Because
I was turned on to Geoffrey Madden by one of the really good aphoristic writers of my circle, Anthony Lane, the New Yorker's movie critic, wonderfully witty, sour, and secretly Christian and conservative writer, though he doesn't advertise it too much in the pages of the New Yorker. He did a brilliant piece about T.S. Eliot not long ago in our pages, where I think you could sense through the diaphanous surface of cosmopolitanism the actually subversive conservatism of his views. But Geoffrey Madden, I urge everyone to find. You can find him in any library. He kept diaries that were essentially collections of aphorisms, his own and other people's, for a space of 40 or 50 years. He was one of those brilliant Brits who were so traumatized by the Great War that they essentially withdrew into a world of literature and of literary craft. But it's exactly that same combination of wit and skeptical intelligence radiating out towards all things that I think you find in Geoffrey Madden as well. I wish I could summon back from my memory, but it was 5 years ago when I read him. The specifics of it, but it's a very similar kind of sensibility, and one that's, as this evidence, is relatively obscure.
Graham Greene wasn't an aphorist, but he strikes me as having more of a commonality with Fuster than in the end.
What an interesting comparison. I would not have thought of that, but yes, isn't that true? Yeah.
I mean, as a Catholic writer, he's there's a sensuality, I think, in both of them.
Well, isn't it true also as well, and we could connect Rochefoucauld to this for that matter, that they're fed up with the hypocrisies of bourgeois society, right? Because bourgeois society depends on polite lies, right? I'm glad to see you. It's wonderful to be here. Your children look great. You must be so proud of them. All of that fabric of lies that bourgeois society depends on to go along.
The euphemism is already a lie.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And Graham Greene is drawn to Catholicism and to communism because he doesn't like that world of bourgeois self-deception.
Right.
He'd much prefer a spy who deceives others to a middle-class man who deceives himself. And I think something of that same sensibility is at play here. I'd not thought of that at all, but I think that's true.
I only thought of it listening to you.
I wonder if we want to open up a little bit of time
Please.
for a Q&A.
Please.
Would that be
Yeah, sure.
good?
Yeah.
So we have one comment that came from a dear colleague of ours, Miriam Basilio, who was watching elsewhere and wasn't able to put the comment. So I'm going to read her question. And while I'm doing that, I would invite our audience to also think of the questions that they might have so that we have time to engage our panelists before our time runs out. So so this question is for Marianne about your wonderful use of Twitter to post an aphorism a day, in
Indeed.
which you created a dialogue about translation and Fuster. So Miriam wanted to hear more about that, or ask you about that. Or you don't have to answer that, but that's her question.
It's interesting. I mean, it was a lot of fun. And apparently, when I stopped doing it, I was doing it as I was translating and sort of just as a way to share the
Excitement.
aphorisms with people, with random people I didn't know. And there were people, when I stopped doing it, because when I finished the translation, I stopped tweeting. I'm not really sure why, but I wasn't working on them day by day. And a couple of people wrote and said, wait, what's happening? Why aren't there any more aphorisms? So it was a very lovely kind of conversation. But the thing is, Twitter is very often a one-sided conversation. So. But I was happy to share them. It was, not everybody. One of the problems with a book like this is, I don't know what bookstores it will be in. We had the incredible luxury of having Adam do the prologue, but that's I'm.
We'll be in McNally Robinson, I'm sure, and in the.
I called them and they don't have it, but I'm going to go to.
I was going to say on my way.
192.
We'll all call and ask for it, and then
Yes,
they'll
I
have to
think
order it
that's-
in.
That will be the way.
It's true that Twitter is a one-sided conversation, and when it's two-sided, it's usually not a conversation. It's exactly. But if I may say, one of the things that's great about having a book like this is that the curious thing that books have that no other form has is that they can live underground, above ground for decades, for years, and they still have a life. There's no other art form I think of that has plays. If you write a play and the play fails, I know to my pain, it's essentially finished. It exists in some form, but it really doesn't. And the same thing is obviously true about performances and so on. Books are like time capsules in themselves.
They're to be rediscovered.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No. Well, I'm hoping that will happen. But
Other questions? Marianne knows that I always have a million, so
Oh, please.
I'm gonna first see if anyone else has one before I jump in. So I have a question about Fuster and the variety of work that he did, and thinking about kind of forms of communication, and to your comments about Twitter not being a kind of medium for dialogue. But do you consider in Fuster writing aphorisms and the many varieties of ways that he published that he was seeking dialogue through different forms of writing? It strikes me that that variety of writing is also something that Doors shared, and that for writers who use the press, it's very present, in which the press is a particularly public form of expression right before digital media. And it always strikes me that when artists and writers use the press, it's for pay, but it's also for the hope of readership and dialogue in a more public forum. And I was just wondering if you could think about, is the aphorism made to create that form of dialogue, or is it the kind of punctual expression that is meant to stay there and drop and be picked up, but not necessarily return to sender kind of thing?
I would love to hear what Adam thinks about this, because I just, in doing the translations, I feel as though this is how Fuster thought, and he would, so he would write down a thought and then look for the opposite. So it was his way of developing an idea that then might appear in a longer article. But I think it's either the condensation of something or his
spark,
his own process of thinking. You know, just one small comment about the Twitter. Twitter is a perfect medium for aphorisms. You know, it is. You know, it's one of the beauties of Twitter, actually, that you have to think about what you're saying and say it quickly. But I do have the sense that they're crystallizations of a thought for him. I don't know if you.
I think that's true. One of the things that's appealing, I think, about this beautiful book, but also about the aphoristic tradition, is that you have the sense, at least, that the author isn't compelled to communicate, to take pleasure in the accomplishment. I think that's something that we feel strongly reading it, that having written something this smart and concise, you could confide it to your drawer and you wouldn't feel it was time wasted in the way that a short story or something else would be unpublished. But let me just add quickly that I had forgotten, because I quoted it, when I was saying a moment ago about Fuster and being fed up with the bourgeois lies of life. He says it perfectly, of course, far better than I could. Every name is a pseudonym, every face a mask, every gesture an affectation, every word an equivocation. And in those conditions, man is a social animal. That sums it up perfectly, right? Every single thing we do socially is feigning and dissembling. Those are the necessary circumstances for us to be social at all. That's a profound thought, put in a very brief compass. And this is, again, the thing that appeals to me so much, of being both a conservative temperament and a liberal, or maybe a conservative form and a liberal temperament, is that it's both a critique of our social hypocrisy and an embrace of it. Those are the conditions in which we can go on.
If I can add something, it came to my mind a word in our language, and is I don't know the translation. Maybe you can help here. I think with a lot of the aphorism, he wanted to saxetar our minds. He wanted us to react, to the readers to react, maybe not to dialogue, but to react and to think. This is
what a beautiful word. It's a verb to
yes, saxetar, yes, to shake.
Saxetar, to shake up, yeah.
To shake up, but it has such a beautiful sound too. It's with a. I will remember
It
that.
sounds like shaking.
It sounds more like shaking than shaking does.
Yes. Yeah. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you. Yes, I have a question for Marianne. Because you said that you have been reading these aphorisms since the 70s, no?
No, actually, I only read the aphorisms now. I've been reading Fuster since the 70s.
Oh, not the aphorisms.
So I was reading his newspaper articles, but in the 90s, when I was working on my dissertation, I read his book, Indagaciones y Propostas, which was published in that yellow collection of the best works of Catalan literature, La Molc. And in fact, I went back to it and I saw that the end of Indagaciones y Propostas, which also is a kind of compilation, includes a lot of the aphorisms from Final Judgements. But I only found this book when I started translating it, it was a steep learning curve. But anyway, beyond that, what was the question, Bruno?
Yeah,
Sorry.
I was about to ask you, how was to reread aphorisms, the same aphorisms, for 40 years, and how you've changed, and the text prevails and everything changed, and that experience. Right. But the other question could be, how did Fuster organize his aphorisms? Were they organized by periods, or by collections?
You know, that's a question I've asked myself as well, because I don't know if he kind of took his notebooks and published them, or if it doesn't seem to me that they are grouped by by theme in any way. In fact, the themes are recurring throughout the book, but rarely is there a series of aphorisms that refer to one another. And I think that makes it a very dynamic read. The essays that I read when I read him before were more long form and always very mordant. I mean, it's the same sensibility, but there's something so powerful about the aphorisms, about they're like little firecrackers, or little bombs. And, it's very hard to do that in an essay. So the essays are beautifully developed and very intelligent and all of that, but this is kind of the heart and soul, the core. And also where he plays, where he will contradict himself and be absolutely sanguine about it, I think he starts the book with that. You all know the famed Greek aphorism, Joan Fuster is the measure of all things. And yet I endorse methodical mistrust. So, he's always undermining whatever he declares, he undermines almost immediately, which is so much fun.
Yes.
First of all, I wanted to say that it's a huge honor to be here. I'm from his town, so it's impressive to be here right now. And I wanted
where?
to know from Sueca. I'm from his town. So,
Oh, wow.
Oh,
Beautiful.
oh my goodness, wonderful, good.
So, what I wanted to know is what in the first place drew you to him before everything else? Like, what was the first thing that drew you to his writing and his way of seeing the world, which was, at the time, I mean, growing in the town, I mean, I can talk from my family's perspective, which I can say
Please
that
tell us, because I'm
I
really,
mean,
really curious.
I can relate because I come from a very traditional, very conservative family. It's been 7 years in the country, by the way. So it is, I mean, when I walked in and I heard people speaking in Valencia, I was like, oh my God, where am I? So, yeah, basically what I wanted to know, because, yeah, there's this contradiction between, okay, I was born in a very Catholic household, and when you start seeing the world in a different way, like when you start reading, you go to college, that kind of stuff, it flips your world on its head.
Well, even in college, he was still a phalangist, I think. He was in the phalangist youth, right?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. But he changed. And I'm not sure exactly what flipped him. I think maybe just reality, He was everywhere when I was, when I first got involved in Catalan culture in the 70s and 80s, he was writing everywhere. So it's not that it was hard to avoid him. I didn't want to avoid him. He was brilliant, and he wrote satire. So, the only way to react to Francoism was through satire. That it was a salvation. It's like the Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert now, under Trump. No, well, I have to see them because they need to give me my reality check. But the aphorisms, in fact, were thanks to the Academia, that said we want to translate a book this year, and I found this Consell and said this is the one we're going to do, and everybody agreed because it's such a brilliant book. But thank you for that. And welcome.
Do you not think, too, that just speaking about Fuster as a phalangist and so on, it is still easier for us to recreate an empathetic reaction to those who were seduced by the far left in the same period? Auden, for W.H. Auden, I just was talking about tonight. We don't have a lot of difficulty understanding what wooed Auden to the far left in the 1930s.
No.
But we have a harder time understanding what could have wooed someone like Fuster to the far right, even though they're very similar kinds of infatuations.
Yeah, in his case it was his family, right?
Right.
But I think it's hard for us to feel sympathy for it, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
you feel sympathy for him because he rejected it. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
No, but I think it wasn't uncommon, no? How would that have been in the Basque Country?
About?
Were there people who were sort of conservative Christians who flipped into?
Of course.
Yes. Yeah,
A lot of
so-
people who they went to the, they were Catholic, really Catholic, and then they went to the priest schools, and then they became Marxists.
And nationalists.
And yeah. So yeah, it was
It was it was a phenomenon that you know. But
that was-
Fuster is born in 1922, so he lived under he was a teenager under the Republic.
yeah.
Just a
And-
teenager, and then
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the Civil War, he's 22, 39, he was 17, and his family was, very religious and
But it was in the 40s and 50s. It was impossible to be like
Anything else.
anything else in Spain. It was totally impossible. So all the people who were like progressive, they were exiled or they were killed. So yeah, it was impossible. And then in the 60s, late 50s, so Spain also Franco changed a little bit his regime, and it became a little bit more open. So everything changed. The economy changed.
yes.
It changed in Spain in the late 50s, the beginning of the 60s. So a lot of inputs come from abroad.
From France,
From
Europe.
from
yeah.
France, and then it's the beginning of this, like this opening little bit, because at the 40s and the 50s, so writing in Basque or writing in Catalan, it was totally you couldn't. So
I think it is
in Spain,
It is the Catalan language that makes him start to reject all of that.
Yeah.
It's wanting to write in Catalan and that sense of devotion to the language, and which was rejected. But I'll tell an anecdote about Eugeni Dors. When he and Dionisio Ridruejo were Phalangists, and Phalangism is a kind of fascist socialism. So, and they wanted to write propaganda in Catalan. When Franco was coming into the city of Barcelona, they wanted to throw leaflets of Catalan Falangist propaganda, and Franco forbade them to do it, which was wonderful, because if there had been fascist propaganda in Catalan, there would probably be a lot more Catalan fascists.
yeah.
Good. Yes.
Hi, I have a question for Marianne. You mentioned how when translating from other foreign, smaller languages and cultures to English, there's a lack of contextualization when bringing it here. How does that affect your translation of it, if it does, or do you have it in mind?
Well, not exactly the lack of context, but inevitably in translation you'll find that there's some cultural either use of a word. For example, one of the words that Fuster repeats a number of times is vulgar or vulgar or vulgaritat, which does not mean vulgar and vulgarity in English. But in each case, it meant something different. So once I translated it as cheesy, another time I translated it, I don't remember. And there's one in particular that is another one of my favorites, which was...
Is it up here, Marion? Do you have it in your...
No, it's one of... He said, in order for something truly to move you, it has to be a little bit corny. And then in Catalan that was, perquè una cosa realment et comogui ha de tenir un punt de vulgaritat. I had to manipulate. I mean, that's translation. That's simply saying, in this context, that's the word we would use. But often you have to, in a novel, for example, you may have to write an ellipsis that will give people information so that they understand the reference. In an aphorism, there's no room to do that. You know, so you just have to find the way to flip it. And aphorisms are often constructed like one-liners, you know, where you have a proposition in the first clause and an undermining of the proposition in the second clause. So sometimes if the joke hinges on a double use of the word, you have to find a way to get around that. But these really are, I don't know if I think Adam will agree, these are, we needed somebody to say, this is a book of aphorisms that's a world-class book of aphorisms.
Yeah.
But the book itself is completely comprehensible on its own. I mean, it didn't need a lot of, because it exists on a sort of universal plane.
I certainly felt that way. As I said, they swam into my life as an amazing and brilliant new constellation of aphorisms, and I think Fuster is an aphorist on par with any who's practiced. I think they are world class. It fascinates me, though, that he chose Catalan to write in. You know, I come from Quebec originally, which is a similar kind of small culture. Now, it doesn't have an entirely separate language. It has a version of French, but it's a very specific version of French. Yes. And the choice of Quebecois writers, of whether to write in the colonial language of international French or to use the Quebecois French is a cultural decision that you make every time. It's not different in as much as you read it almost the same, but it has significant differences.
But the parallel would also be choosing to write in Quebecois or French versus English.
Yes,
Yeah.
that would certainly,
Yes.
and that's a choice that every ambitious Quebec writer has to face, right?
Yeah.
You're writing in a sea, you're writing your language in a sea of an alien, of a foreign language. Absolutely.
And that French and Quebecois is kind of looked down on a bit, you know, that
By the French?
by the French.
Yeah, oh my God, yes.
So I think we're coming toward the end of our program, but I actually wanted to invite our panelists, if you wanted to end perhaps by choosing one of the aphorisms from the book to close with before we close our program. I know each of you have thought of many. Marianne, we have some in the PowerPoint if you want me to pull any up. But I would love to, for us to be able to close the program calling out a few more of Fuster's aphorisms. Adam, do you have one in mind already?
I do indeed, and let me just say again, thank you for putting up with my late arrival, and to congratulate Marianne Newman again on this absolutely wonderful book, which will now enter the world's imagination. It may be slowly, but as we have all learned to our pain, a tiny little virus entering one organism can have global effects. One I quoted is a great favorite of mine, which I have sent to pretty much every of my editors at the New Yorker. Clarity is born of argument, and experience shows that, in effect. I beg your pardon. Clarity is born of argument, they say, and experience shows that, in effect, people tend to hold on to the same convictions they had before they argued, but now with more clarity.
That's so great.
That's a good one. Marianne, do you have one already?
I have.
Well, you have the whole book that you love, but I'll make you choose one.
I don't know if Cameron, do you have one in?
Yeah,
in mind?
I have a lot, but I would like to tell a couple of them. So this was a little bit. So this shocked me. It was writing, making literature. Is all those things you? I can't. You say it is, and a form of vengeance.
Of vengeance.
Vengeance to boot.
Yes.
Yeah. And then another one, this is beautiful, it's think of something else and you will find peace. I think this is
Lovely and simple.
Yeah. So to be a writer is that. Yeah.
Sometimes, don't you have the impression, that, for example, this one, writing, making literature is
Yeah.
all those things you say it is, and a form of vengeance to boot, that's
Yes.
directed to somebody.
Yeah.
That he's thinking, I'm going to get fulano with this.
Maybe.
I have one from here, which is, don't kid yourselves, friends who attend concerts. Music, all music, from Palestrino or Bach to Armstrong or Stravinsky, is meant to be danced or sung.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Maria Jose, do you want to close out with one?
Yes. I said that the one I love the most was, I said before that the most, the only way of read is reread, but I'm reading now another one that I like very much. We can only be refused by someone who thinks like us.
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
it's wonderful.
So I'd like to thank you all again
Yeah.
for coming. Thanks again to Maria Jose Galvez for joining us and doing such a beautiful job moderating the conversation. Thanks again to Veronica Canto, who joined us from Valencia, and to thank, of course, our panelists, Adam Gopnik, Cameron Uribe, Marianne Newman. You have really brought Fuster to life to us tonight, and we are so grateful. For those of you here in person, there's a reception following.
Pleasure.
Pleasure. Marian, you must forgive me. I don't want to.
No, you do.
But this was
Thank you.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. So glad. Let's get together soon and have lunch and talk.
I
This
will
is a
let you.
beautiful book.
Thank you so much.
Would you sign it for me?
Oh, I would.